My name is Rama Carl. I am Professor of Digital Media and Animation at Florida Gulf Coast University. Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how to rig a character for reusability. A character rig that's reusable is one that can handle scaling, it can be used with other characters, and you can use it in a variety of contexts. Okay, now we're ready to start rigging. We're going to create what's called an FK rig first, and that's a forward kinematic rig. That is a rig that has joints and a skin. And an FK rig can lead us either to creating an IK rig, which is used for keyframe animation, or an MC rig, which is used for motion capture animation. But the starting point of both of those is an FK rig that basically is a relationship between the joints and a binding of joints to skin to joints. So we're going to create that rig. We'll start this by going to the human IK. This is tiny little man icon in the top right corner. And I'm going to select Create Skeleton. Naming is very important because we want the names to refer to our character and not conflict with other objects. Also, is much easier to keep track of things, so naming is very important. The very first thing you should do is go to the drop down and select Rename Character. I'm going to call this Old Man. Click OK. We have Old Man reference, Old Man hips, and now we have all of the joints are labeled Old Man. The Old Man object is our mesh, and I'm going to rename this as Old Man Geom. Now I know what everything is here. Everything that is this character is called Old Man something. So Old Man Geometry, Old Man Reference. I'm going to change Old Man Reference to joints because I find that easier to remember what's going on. And so you should start by renaming things because this will keep things much easier to keep track of things. Now, the first step in working with joints is where are they? If we zoom out, we'll see that the joints are at a very large scale, and we want to bring them down to our unit scale, our world scale. So how do we do that? We want to scale the joints of a mesh. If you select the hips and you try to scale just these, you'll find that things scale strangely. You're only scaling the hips, you're not scaling everything else. We want to scale the whole skeleton. If we want to scale the joints, we need to click on the hips and then say select hierarchy. That way all of the joints are selected. Now we can scale them down. We can scale down to the size that we need. So we're going to keep scaling down by dragging on the yellow box until our joints match the size that we want. So now we can go to the attribute editor, and now we want the translate for the hips to be set to 1 meter along Y. That is the typical height for the hips, is around 1 meter, and so this will bring the entire skeleton down roughly to the size that we want. Now we're going to look from the left or look from the side, and I'm going to move this cylinder out of the way just so that it's not in the way of what I'm doing. Select the hips. If you want to see this more easily, you can go to Shading and turn on X-ray. That will let you see through the character, so you can work on this. We're going to select the hips. Now you see that the feet of the joints don't exactly touch the ground. We're going to use W to translate the character down a bit so that the ball of the foot sits right in the heel, and the joints should be right inside the body, roughly inside the body. Now look from the front, we'll see that the arms are not quite scaled down completely. We would really like the arm joints to be right inside of the arms without having to move them individually. So we want to try and move them as little as possible because that will mess up the motion capture later. So I'm going to scale. Remember, if you need to scale, that you need to select by hierarchy. So again, we go to select hierarchy, and now scale down a little bit further. This actually causes the feet to rise up a little bit, so I'm going to scale it down a little. It's kind of an iterative process. It's a little tricky because you have to make sure that when you translate, you only have this hip selected. But when you scale, you need to have the whole hierarchy selected. So now we're getting close. You see the arms are sitting right inside of there, and they are sitting inside the foot quite nicely. I'm taking you through this way of doing it where you iterate between scaling and moving because it's very important if you're going to do any motion capture that you try and match the T-pose as closely as possible. Okay. So now we're ready to start positioning individual joints. We still need to position individual joints because they may not line up exactly where they need to. And rigging is a very precise process, so we need our joints to be right at the correct places. So what we're going to do is switch to a two-panel view. You can find this on the left. And on one side, I'm going to make sure that that's also turned into X-ray. I'm going to use the front, and on the other side, I'm going to use the right side, the side. So that way I can see how what I'm selecting and how things are lining up in both views. So it's best to start from the hips and the work outward because everything moves as you move the hips. So if I move the hips, everything is going to move. So I'm going to start by doing the joint just above the hips. The hips looks pretty good. I'm going to move the next joint, move this one. Those look pretty good actually. Maybe I want the back to be a little farther, the spine to be further. Keep in mind these should be fairly small motions. You shouldn't be doing large motions at this point. For the arms, it can be easier to see what's happening on the top, so I can click on the little arrow above front and I'll get a top view. And now I can position the hand more easily. You can see that the joints for the fingers are almost well lined up. I'm going to shift them around a little bit to get them where I want if you're interested in working with fingers. So I'm going to just do this very roughly at this point, but you can come back and do a more precise positioning of the finger joints. So I'm going to finish with the head. This neck joint actually should go up much further. So I'm going to bring the neck up much further and over. And now I'm going to bring the head to be fully inside of the head and kind of centered on where the skull would be. I'm going to switch back to a perspective view, a single view. On the left there's a button for that. And I'm going to switch back to perspective. And now I'm going to take a look at how this looks. If I look around, the T-pose looks proper, that everything looks very straight, the arms are very straight, and the mesh has been modified so that it's in a proper T-pose with only very minor adjustments to where the joints are from the T-pose. So this is a good way to rig a character for reusability. We'd like all this to be part of one character. So we have our geometry and our joints are separate from that right now. We're not ready to bind yet. We want to create this as a complete rig. So what we're going to do is going to go to create locator. We're going to rename this locator as old man rig underscore rig. We're going to put both our geometry and our joints underneath that rig locator. So I'm going to select the joints. I'm going to hold down the middle mouse button, and that will allow me to drag this somewhere else. You see in the outliner, I'm going to drag this under rig. And now you can see that that has placed the joints underneath rig as a child of rig. I'm going to do the same for the geometry. I'm going to hold down the middle mouse button without rolling it. I'm not using it like a wheel. I'm just dragging the mouse with the middle mouse held down. I'm dragging that under rig. And now I have the joints and the geometry underneath rig, which means that now that rig represents my complete character. It has everything it needs to represent that character. And if I add other parts of the character, such as accessories or something, they could also go under this rig. What we want to do is make sure that there's no additional transforms so that when we get to doing animation, the animation can be applied to this very easily. So I'm going to go to the old man, not the rig shape, but the rig, and see that the transforms are translate, rotate, and scale. Translate should be 0, rotate should be 0, and scale should be 1. The same with the joints. So here on the geometry, the translate, rotate, and scale are 0, 0, and 1. And I'm actually going to go so far as to lock these for the geometry. So I'm going to right click and lock attribute for transform, lock attribute for rotation, and lock attribute for scale. And for the geometry in particular, I want to turn off inherits transform. That will fix a lot of other issues you might have with mirroring and ghosting. At this point, we want to save our mesh. Make sure that you save things under a different number. So I'm going to save this as a number 3, just so I have a record of the past. So we're about ready to skin, but we can see that when I move the rig, that the joints move, but the mesh does not move. So the skin now needs to be bound to the joints. We select the hips, select hierarchy, and now all of the joints appear white. We want to also select the geometry that we're going to bind. This is required. So we hold down the control key and we click on geometry. And now if you look closely, we should have all of the joints selected in white, and we should have the mesh selected in green, and rig and joints in our outline are not selected, but the things that are selected are hips and geometry. If you've gotten this, you can now go to rigging And now I'm going to skin, and I'm going to click on the box next to bind skin. Don't just click bind skin. We want to do this in the proper way. So we're going to click on the selection box. This brings up the box for bind skin. And I'm going to select the properties here. So I want joint hierarchy. The bind method should be geodesic voxel. This is an important choice. And the skinning method should be dual quaternion. Everything else should be the same. So we have geodesic voxel with dual quaternion. And now we do apply and close. Now we're able to confirm that the binding happened by selecting a joint and just rotating that joint. You can see I'm rotating the shoulder now. The arm moves. So I'm going to select the elbow, and just the forearm moves with the hand. If it doesn't move properly, then you need to redo the binding and undo the binding, go back to your previous step. So you can see the hand flexes properly. The leg swings back and forth properly. If I get the foot, I can rotate the foot, and I can also rotate the toe independently. So this is what you should get from using the geodesic voxel method, is a fairly well-rigged character that has that kind of behaves the way you would expect as you rotate the joints. You can even kind of rotate the spine, and everything should rotate properly with it. And this is the basics of rigging a character. The way that we would like to have it set up is that the only thing that really should be selectable and movable is the top level thing that represents the whole rig. That means that I now have a lot more flexibility with a locator. That means I can scale my model and everything will work properly. If I haven't done identity transforms for the joints and the geometry, then the rig would not be able to scale so easily. So this is really one of the key aspects of making something reusable, is that I can scale it and will still work at whatever scale I've set it without getting weird artifacts and strange things. And now those identity transforms are locked for the joints and the geometry. And the only thing that's not locked is the transforms for the whole rig itself. We've finished creating an FK rig, but we might want to adjust the weight paints so the skin deforms more naturally. We'll see how to do that in the next video.